In the last lecture module, we looked at the structure of arguments and how each component of that structure helped arguments to fulfill their function as models of potential inferences. In this lecture module, we're going to turn our attention to our first real substantive skill, that of identifying and extracting arguments. So we want to look at how to go about listening to or reading or consuming a piece of verbiage and deciding whether or not that paragraph, that verbal statement contains an argument, and if so, how to go about extracting that argument. We'll begin by discussing some of the benefits of argument extraction. Then we'll turn our attention to 4 steps in argument extraction. And in this lecture, for the rest of the lecture, we'll be focusing on the first 2 of those 4 steps. We'll look at how to go about identifying whether a bit of spoken or written language is a good candidate for containing an argument. In discussing identification of a potential argument in a bit of written or spoken language, we'll focus really on 2 kinds of features. We'll look at contextual assessments of speaker or author intent, and we'll look at orthographic features, that is, superficial features that fairly reliably correlate with a high likelihood that a bit of spoken or written language contains an argument. The second step that we'll focus on in this particular lecture will be formalization and understanding an argument. Once we've identified that a bit of spoken or written language contains an argument, then we want to be able to extract that argument and put it into standard form, that is, reformulate it to give it its maximal comprehensibility, rigor, and impact. In looking at formalizing and understanding an argument, we'll go through the 4 steps of formalizing an argument, talking about each one, and that's where we'll end the lecture. Let's pivot then to discussing our first skill, identifying and extracting arguments. Oftentimes, when a skill or even a bit of content is introduced in a course, there's no rationale, no context provided for students as to why this skill is being taught to them, why it's important, what's in it for them. And oftentimes, students dislike skills, or even they don't understand or dislike particular content segments of a course precisely because they have no context as to why it is they're being taught that. They're just being told to learn it. And I try in this class never to do that. So we want to start this section by talking about why it is that being able to identify and extract an argument is such an important skill for someone to have and to develop in the context of this course and in the context of their university education. So one important reason why we want to be able to identify and extract arguments is because doing so helps us to better understand our own views and helps us to better understand the views of other people, and therefore greatly facilitates both our own self-understanding but also our constructive interactions with other individuals. It will allow us to present a more rigorous, easily comprehensible, and impactful statement of our reasoning to another person or to ourselves, so that we're really clear about why it is we believe something, or we're really clear in telling someone else why it is we think they should follow us and adopt the inference that we're modeling in our argument. The ability to identify and extract arguments also facilitates an ability to understand and see connections between ideas in other people and in ourselves. And this ability to connect ideas together, to see why it is that particular views are associated together, or why a particular piece of information is important or unimportant to a view. This is a crucial bit of critical thinking skill. And finally, perhaps the biggest payoff, or at least as large as any other, is that by identifying and extracting arguments, we're able to take that argument, put it into its best, most sympathetic form, and then evaluate it as a good reason for adopting the conclusion. So we can evaluate other people's arguments, decide whether or not they give us good reasons to accept their conclusions. We can also do the same thing for our own views. We can look at the reasons why we believe something, evaluate whether or not those reasons in fact really do support the conclusion, the belief that we have, and whether or not they really do support it in the way and to the extent that we think that they do. So for all of these reasons, the ability to identify and extract an argument in a bit of written or spoken language is a really important and valuable skill. I might have convinced you that this is an important skill to learn, but you might now be thinking, yeah, but could it really be very hard? Is this really something that you need to teach me explicitly? And what I think we'll find when we start paying attention to arguments as they occur in the real world is that certainly in verbal, ordinary discourse, but also even in carefully prepared written presentation, arguments aren't as pristine and well-crafted as we'd like to believe they are. There's oftentimes missing material. For example, people will often omit things that in their mind are just obvious, but that may provide important connections for people and may not be obvious to the consumers of their arguments. They might include material that they think is important, but which isn't important, that doesn't further support a conclusion, and they may present material out of order. And this happens a lot. I may give you a couple of reasons to accept a view, then interacting with you, I see some skepticism on your face, and so I might go back and give you more. And as a result, you've got an argument where some of the premises are at the beginning, then there's a conclusion, and then there is some more premises. Or I may start with my conclusion and then start giving you reasons for accepting that conclusion. Or I may give you all my reasons, but in a jumbled order, and then draw my conclusion. When we look at arguments in the wild, as it were, we'll find that they're rarely perfectly crafted gems of inference modeling. And you might think now, well, geez, now you make it sound like it's terrible and overwhelming and I couldn't possibly get very good at this. But in fact, I've got what I call Dr. Chuck's 4 steps for identifying and extracting arguments that I think if we just follow them systematically and patiently, it makes argument identification and extraction pretty straightforward. The first step in this process is simply identifying what bits of written or spoken language are likely to contain arguments, are good candidates for argument extraction. The second step is to take those good candidates and extract the argument from them, understanding the nature of its inferential claim, putting it into a more or less standard formalization that makes it comprehensible, rigorous, and easy to evaluate. And then we can evaluate the underlying logical structure of the argument if we need to. That is, we'll look at, in the second lecture, a technique, our first technique, for evaluating the underlying logical structure of deductive arguments. And that will be our second skill in the arguments module, is using the counterexample method to demonstrate that an argument is invalid, has bad logical form. And of course, as we were noting with inferences and with arguments, good, successful arguments combine 2 elements. They have good content, they have good initial information, and they have good logical form. The structure of the argument relates the information from the premises to the conclusion in such a way that the inferential claim will get satisfied. So 2 ways of criticizing an argument are to criticize its underlying structure, its logical form. The other way, to criticize the content, the truth, likely truth, or evidence for the premises. Now, we've already actually been studying methods, techniques for evaluating an argument's content, and so we won't focus on that in this section at all.